You're listening to Brainpower.
I'm trying to free your mind, but I can only show you the door. You're the one that has to walk through.
You're listening to Brainpower.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Brainpower. It is season 2, episode 2. Now, when we first kicked off season 2, we promised bigger and better than ever, but technically speaking, we didn't promise fast. So give me a break on that. No, all jokes aside, we have been working hard on all things Brainpower, all things Morpheus, and trying to bring you, a fantastic guest list and really, build out the show for all the things that we promised for season 2. And this episode absolutely delivers that. David and I have Paul Allen joining us. Paul of SOAR AI, formerly the founder of Ancestry.com. Holy smokes, when I tell you that Paul is an incredible source of knowledge, so interesting to talk to, and we hit on a huge array of topics, ranging from the normal stuff, of course, decentralized AI, the political and technological and financial implications of decentralized AI and all of the things that you're used to us talking about and we're working on. And then we dive into some very deep rabbit holes as well that are very interesting. And so stick around, check it out. Thank you for joining us as always. Let's get into it. Okay, everyone listening, I just had to emergency hit record because Paul started talking and I was like, I have to capture all of this because it is, I think, everything out of the guy's mouth, and I just met him 3 minutes ago, has been insightful, which is fantastic. And so everyone listening to this should be in on it as well. Welcome back to Brainpower, and Paul, welcome to Brainpower.
Oh, thanks. It's great to be here with both of you guys.
Oh, absolutely. So we promised our listener, our viewership, that with season 2, or I guess I promised that I wouldn't make him sit through a biopic of every single guest that we have on, which was kind of my go-to before. But I do want to, we have to touch at least a little bit on your background, Paul, before we get in here. The phrase I used to throw out there is, who the heck are you? Can you give just a quick background? Because I don't know that I could serve it a justice. I have my notes pulled up and I'm like, if I look up the word entrepreneur, your face is right there.
Well, the funniest thing is I had zero interest in entrepreneurship or business when I was a kid. I loved school. I loved learning. I every class I took in college, I wanted to major in that subject. I was a Russian major in college. After studying political science and international relations, I took my first Russian language class, and man, that first day just captured me. And I love Russian literature, Russian culture, and history. And so my last career objective would have ever been to be in business, to be an entrepreneur. If you think about a caste system, I always thought that the business folks were at the very bottom. And my dad was a professor. My mom was a teacher. Academia is a noble calling. So there's the priest class and the warrior class, all these kind of philosopher class. And then there's the business people, which for me growing up was just zero interest or appeal until my first company, which I was embarrassed to start a company, but I used to frame it as, well, I built a learning product, for scripture study, and we put it out on CD-ROM. So we grew this company to several million in revenue, made the Inc. 500, go to Philadelphia in May of 96, and I'm in a room with hundreds of winners of the Inc. 500. And I'm like, wow, these are the coolest, best people I have ever met in my life. They have vision, they have dreams, they're creating jobs. I just flipped instantly and said, being an entrepreneur is a great calling. It's a very noble thing to have an idea and bring it into existence. And so ever since then, I've been trying to catch up from all the stuff I missed. I didn't take any business classes. Obviously, I learned hard lessons along the way. When Ancestry raised $75 million in venture funding which grew to a several $100 million valuation in the Series A, B, and C, I didn't know what liquidation preferences were. I didn't know what redemption rights or even board governance. I was clueless. And so we, of course, made a million mistakes, that very, very costly mistakes. But ever since then, since 96, I've been trying to study business, entrepreneurship, go to conferences all the time. I love the fact that there's so much knowledge at everybody's fingertips right now. There's no excuse for people to fail in starting a business if they just pay attention to the successful formulas and techniques and tactics, which are all over the place. I guess it's a noise to signal issue because there's a lot of kind of AI slop, and then there's a lot of human slop. That's human influencers who have a big audience but know nothing about the subject. But if they post something on Instagram, they'll get 1 million views, and the smartest person in the world doesn't post on Instagram. They write a paper that 2,000 people in the entire world read. So the volume of noise compared to the signal is pretty bad. It's out of whack. But I do think the option exists now for almost everyone to succeed in work and in life in every area because intelligence is at our fingertips, and that's never been possible before in human history.
I think that's something to kind of focus on today is, you've had such an interesting background building these different companies. And in recent years, you've been doing so much work on freedom technology, right? I think freedom tech, honestly is the most important tech because how do we get, as you were saying earlier, the benefits of capitalism to as many people as possible? Well, you have to lower the barrier, right? For them to be able to access it. And if you've got access to intelligence, you can do so much more than you could before. I've seen it in my own life with, having an agent the last 4 months, right? Since the OpenClaw moment, I've coded more in the last 120 days than I did the last 20 years, right? It's an incredible multiplier if you have, drive, ambition, agency, and it could really sort of take away those technical barriers that were always sitting there. And so, it was great to hear what you said in Dallas and sort of lay out that vision for you can almost rethink all the things we've taken as presumptions, like your efforts to bring transparency to government. Nobody could read the whole tax code before, but all of a sudden I have an agent that can actually digest it or keep track of all the court cases or all the politicians and what they're saying or all the regulations that are being proposed. I mean, that was a gargantuan sort of unattainable thing. How could you possibly do that? Especially given the decline of journalism. The people that were supposed to be doing that, and there's a lot of things that they weren't really doing that, but at least you thought they were doing that, 20, 30 years ago. As that went away, it's what's going to replace that? So I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts and your vision for where we're headed in that regard, because that was one of the more inspiring takes I've heard in a while.
Well, it is a good starting point. CitizenPortal.ai has been around for 3 years. We were fortunate to be discovered by Glenn Beck pretty early on, and so he did a podcast with me, and then he invited me to Dallas to his studio, and we did a 33-minute podcast or video that got 560,000 views, and it raised 1.3 million for Citizen Portal on our crowdfunding platform on Start Engine. Just really from his endorsement, his message was that putting all this knowledge at the fingertips of citizens will shift the balance of power between citizens and the elected class. And so it is super unfortunate that the fourth estate, the fourth branch of government, which was the free press and really independent journalism, for hundreds of years was the greatest check and balance on government overreach. And since the 90s, with the rise of the internet and Google and Facebook getting all the ad revenue and the newspaper industry pretty much dying, major newspapers shutting down, thousands of them. And there are 20% of US counties that don't even have a single paid journalist living in the county today. I was talking to someone from Pennsylvania yesterday, a county of 6,000 people. They've had 3 journalists in the county. One of them died this week, so now they have 2. I'm like, okay, well, yeah. So to your point, David, if AI can transcribe every public meeting in the United States and read every bill and look at every budget, look at all the legislation, look at the party platforms, analyze based on whatever things a citizen cares about, grade and score legislation, there's no reason why super intelligent citizens can't emerge who actually have deep insights about every policy, every priority. And it's really cool to imagine, and this is shout out to John Hart, the CEO of openthebooks.com. John envisioned this gathering in Dallas a couple weeks ago, which you were at, David, and about 75 amazing people came to talk about AI and the future of freedom. We had former Speaker Newt Gingrich send a video in from Switzerland where his wife is ambassador. and he couldn't be there in person, but Harlan Crow, this amazing a guy, gave us access to old Parkland. So these people were gathering to say, how could AI be developed so that freedom is protected and preserved, and that it's not eroded by central powers, whether corporations that run the world on their platforms, and we've ceded our liberty to them, as Travis Oliphant, the amazing inventor of NumPy and SciPy, and maybe the reason Python is the world's most important programming language, at least he was one of the key contributors to that. He says nobody wants to be a serf on the Google plantation because you give them all your data and so that you can use their free products. Like,
Yeah.
That's not a future. So Citizen Portal isn't really here just to provide government transparency, but really to empower citizens with knowledge. And citizens are more important than corporations. Corporations didn't really exist when the founders wrote the Constitution. Limited liability corporations were invented in the 1850s and made their way into the United States. And so what happens when a corporation exists? Well, it, as Peter Thiel says, it wants a monopoly. And so what happened? The railroads, the silver, the oil and gas companies, instantly started colluding and acquiring, and pretty soon they just want a monopoly. And so that's what corporations tend to do. And so humans working inside of corporations often do things that aren't very ethical or kind because they're shielded from liability in some ways. And so CFOs and CEOs make horrible decisions. Laying off 40% of your workforce is actually not a very moral thing to do, but you do it because Wall Street's going to celebrate it. So citizens and humans in general have an uphill fight to preserve our freedom and our prosperity by not having government become too powerful and not having corporations become so powerful and so that they're controlling everything we know or see or do. We really need decentralization. We really need massively distributed capitalism. We really need knowledge of history and what is a good idea and a bad idea. We need a bright light shined on all good policies that have ever been tried in the laboratories of democracy so that they can spread. And then all the bad policies that have victims and that create misery and suffering at scale, which is socialism and central planning and totalitarian authoritarian regimes, they have never blessed the world. They have always been a curse to the world. But young people growing up today, they don't know history. They don't read these books. They haven't talked to someone who lived through it. And so I think it's an opportunity now for those of us on the, good side of the coin, hopefully trying to make a positive impact on the world, to put knowledge, intelligence, and wisdom in the fingertips of billions of people so that their day-by-day decisions can be informed and have a greater chance of leading to prosperity. But that, also that the centrally planning powers of the world become less and less important over time as edge computing provides most of the intelligence that we're all using every day.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to unpack there. So I love what you said about, today there's almost no correlation between what politicians say and what they do, right? And there's been a number of studies on that, right? Something like it's almost a 0% correlation if the population cares about a particular policy, whether that gets put into law. If you're a company and it's like a certain amount of money is donated, there's an 80% correlation that's what gets put into law. And so this idea of have transparency around what's said and committed to, and getting a lot more closer to something like a smart contract where like, this is the expectation, this is what follows, right? And having that transparency, I think is key, right? We've ended up with this surveillance state where they know everything about the citizens and the citizens know almost nothing about the government, right? And it was intended to be the opposite, right? Where citizens had privacy and the government had to be transparent. So I love the vision of kind of flipping the script and getting back to, that check and balance that it created such a healthy, outcome in the past as far as like accountability. But also to your point, on access to intelligence, that's a good point. It's not just intelligence, it's wisdom, right? And I constantly, I'm an economics nerd, so I see all of these incredibly rich graphs that show correlation between here's a policy and here's the outcome of every country in the world on a spectrum, right? And I've seen thousands of these graphs, and it's like, yeah, if you pick that policy, you get this outcome. It's not that complicated, but I feel like I'm one of the very few, because I have that very niche interest in economics, that has that in the background of my mind. And whereas most people hear a policy, oh, that sounds good, they're going to give us free that. Like, no, like, one, there is no free lunch, right? And you can explain some of those concepts. But I think if we've got, wisdom, that's really the key difference, right? It's not just giving people raw information. It's what is that information produced in the past? And I love the way you say the experiments that have been run in the laboratories of democracy, right? Because we've got a lot of data at this point. We've got hundreds of years of data, and what reduces poverty, like what increases happiness, what increases, lifespan, and it's private property and free markets and low regulatory overhead and, the rule of law, right? That, the courts are free and all these things. But, I'm glad that you guys are sort of bringing that in practically and giving people this very sort of everyday tool. It feels like it's almost like a replacement for the local paper and what that was supposed to be, but now on steroids, because every piece of information gets captured and you create this custom output for every citizen based on where they live and the things they care about.
That's exactly right. And even further, Citizen Portal is for citizens, but we have an initiative to launch elected.ai. And the goal of elected.ai is to build a dashboard of democracy for every leader in the world. And I know we're a constitutional republic, but the word democracy gets thrown out there a lot. And we do have democratic processes and systems, but we're a constitutional democratic republic. And so what's missing, in my opinion, and I actually admire a lot of people who run for public office. It's a thankless job. As soon as you decide to run for a local or state office, half the population will hate you without even knowing you. And so it's a thankless job in many ways. It doesn't pay very well. I think Singapore pays their top ministers a couple $1 million a year. That's a smart move, you guys. The reason congressional insiders are doing stock trading that should be illegal is that they don't get paid very much. Probably most people get, in the private sector might get 2 to 5 times as much money as a senator or a member of Congress. And so, they're kind of open-minded to being creative about how they're going to, get wealth in their, 10 or 12-year tenure in Washington, D.C. I think it's disgusting that people in both parties have been stock trading, their staffs have been day trading and trading on insider information. It's horrible. I just can't even believe that any moral person would run for office and then do that. But it happens. It's very common. Hundreds of people and their staffs are doing that. But what electeds need, do you guys have friends that are on the Texas state legislature? You guys anyone who runs for office and is now in charge of voting for $100 billion or $10 billion budget on hundreds of complex modern issues, everyone's over their head. There is no way that you can have expertise in more than 1 or 2 or maybe 3 areas, depending on your career. If you've been an MD your whole life, you probably have some insights into healthcare and health insurance and policies related to that. But what do you know about nuclear energy? What do you know about, telecommunications? What do you know about public sector, public education, or all these complex topics? Citizen Portal has a taxonomy of topics that have been discussed in public meetings since 2020. 300,000 distinct topics that have been discussed at the schools, city, state, or federal level. And that's a lot of content. And as we know, most people don't have time to read the bills that they vote for. It's just, the reality is they're over their head, and the system is very inclined to let a few people make all the decisions. and the electeds on both parties are supposed to kiss the ring and move on. Justin Amash from Michigan, for 10 years, I think he was an independent as a House member, but he read every bill for 10 years, he and his staff. And by the way, he told me that the staff budget for Congress people in the United States is like 1.3 million. They don't even have time to hire staff to read the bills that are coming out. The speaker or the leadership have $30 million annual budgets. And so they can afford all the lawyers and accountants and everybody they need to advise them. But the individual representatives get almost no budget and almost no time to read the bills. And unless you're tenured, you have almost no influence in what gets voted on anyway. So the system's really messed up. But I feel bad for electeds who have good intention when they run for office, because there's no way they can do a good job on everything. They have to listen to experts or lobbyists or the party leadership just to move things forward. But how do you know if you voted for a good bill or a bad bill? Or how do you know if the 10% of it that's bad isn't so bad that it overrides the good that would be done? So David, as an economist, if you've seen thousands of charts that correlate policy to outcomes, why not capture all of that into a dashboard and give that to every elected official in the United States? There are 560,000 or so elected officials in the United States. Ballotpedia founder Leslie Graves told me that 60% of races in the United States are uncontested races. And that shows us that not enough citizens are willing to run for office. 60% of all public offices are filled by the only candidate who is willing to run.
Oh, I totally believe that. I've been joking about running for mayor in the town that I recently moved to, because when I looked into the election, you needed 2,000 votes to win, and it was essentially uncontested. And I was like, 2,000 votes, you could knock on 2,000 doors in 6 months easy. I'm like, that would be cakewalk. But okay, I must say, anyone who listens to the show or knows me personally knows that I am very often I'm very often short on words. There is so much to unpack here that my head is spinning on trying to think of like where I want to start to try to interject and unpack. One thing that you said though, Paul, a little bit ago that I think will really, really resonate with some of our viewership. That is, so I'm about to turn 31. That are like approximately my age or younger, is this idea that, well, one, I think a lot of us have grown really disenfranchised just with the political system in general. I mean, I used to be somebody who was very staunchly on one side. If I was like the conservative guy at Cornell University when I was there. This was back in the 2014 to 2017, I guess into 2018. But the point is, I have grown, and so has a lot of other people, so disenfranchised with like drawing an affiliation with either side and just being like, hey, we feel like the political system is just generally against us, which you acknowledged before. But the other thing that you also acknowledged on the other side of that coin is, hey, capitalism as it exists today, because of the way that corporations function, are also inherently positioned against us because there are not these checks and balances. And so if you pay attention to both of those things in great detail, there's like this middle ground that's like, okay, well, who is for us? And that's ultimately what drew me to these types of decentralized or distributed technologies, was the realization that, well, I don't really need anyone to be for me because the code can be for me.
Right.
Like if the code is law, then I don't need to trust anybody because, or what's the saying? Don't trust, verify. Right. And like you touched on that before and kind of hit both ends of that spectrum. And I'd love to unpack that a little bit. And also, like, how do we get to a point in practice where that exists? Because my other concern is, my opinion is that for someone to promote this type of system, like a truly distributed or decentralized system, you have to be someone who wants truth. Like, you want to seek the truth as much as you possibly can. I do not believe a lot of people want to seek the truth. I think that they're okay with the status quo of saying, well, if we can make people believe we're seeking the truth, then it kind of doesn't matter what we do, look over here, not what I'm actually doing. And I have concerns about people actually adopting this at those higher levels because of that fact.
Well, the book you referenced talks about soma as a drug that you give to people to kind of make them happy or whatever. So I think that digital dopamine and entertainment and alcohol and partying, there's a large number of percentage of the population that's kind of checked out of caring about the truth, caring about reality, and they're just kind of trying to escape from the reality, and they do think the system's rigged against them. So there's so many headwinds right now against a large portion of the population. As I was saying earlier, capitalism's benefits have been captured by a fairly small percentage of humans, and I believe in massively distributed capitalism. I think decentralization, intelligence at your fingertips, agents, a fleet of agents for every person, for every student, for every entrepreneur. Fleets of agents will allow you to do 100 or 1,000 times more work in a day than you could do ever, and start getting prosperity. So I think we've just learned from the last 10, 20 years of iPhones and social media that that the truth that we all used to want, it seems like most people used to want to find the truth and read about it and learn about it and then apply it in their life. But if we've all been distracted, and if the inflation and the economy, if we had continued from the 50s and 60s, where a single wage earner could earn enough money to buy a house in a middle class neighborhood, send all their kids to college with no debt, like the costs of healthcare, the costs of education, the costs of just have extraordinarily grown, partly because of corporate monopoly seeking and then capture, the regulatory capture. We really don't live in a free country at all. If you think about economically, and if you want to start a company in the healthcare space, it is so massively regulated, and insurance pays for most of the medical bills. And so there's really big obstacles to free entrepreneurship in energy, in financial services, in healthcare, even in housing, where there's zoning regulations everywhere. I mean, I live in Missouri, where our real estate agent 5 years ago said, we kept saying, well, what about inspections? And what about permits? And did our septic thing get built right? And, who's done all this work? And she finally just laughed at us and said, you can do anything you want to on your property, as long as you don't kill somebody. Like, it's a county of 8,000 people, 500 square mile county, and you can do anything you want on your property. But the vast majority of the country, especially in the big cities, are highly regulated. Justice Gorsuch published a book earlier this year called Overruled: The Toll the Human Toll of Having Too Many Laws and Regulations. And he captures some very powerful trends over the past 100 years where people have gone to prison for violating laws they didn't know existed. And there are laws at the city, county, or state or federal level that could be applied to almost anybody at any time if there's the lawfare political will to do it. So I actually think that it's not enough to have virtual digital freedom or metaverse freedom. We actually need territories. And I think you guys talked about this in January on your podcast. There need to be physical states or counties or nation states that really do believe in liberty and freedom, and that they are embracing the technology and the political infrastructure to allow for maximum human prosperity and freedom, and less overreach, less and less overregulation, less and less central planning. But the fact is, if you've got a big, beautiful bill that's trillions of dollars of spending, that's pretty much central planning.
Yeah.
And as a Russian major in college, the Soviet Union's 5-year economic plans were the laughingstock of the entire free world, because they made up the plan. They centrally decided how much of every widget to produce over the next 5 years. They made up all the statistics, and everybody living in the Soviet Union knew that it was all a big lie. Mm-hmm. And central planning never has and never will work. What you need is, millions of people, Adam Smith, invisible hand, everybody freely interacting with each other in a free market, and that's how you get optimal productivity and personal fulfillment. And so we've gone so far away from that world. I mean, back 120, 130 years ago, the percentage of our economy that was government spending, I think it was 1% to 2% of our GDP was federal government spending, and I think it's now closer to, between federal and state and local government, I think it's 40% of our economy is now government spending.
Yep.
And that is not what we had for the first 150 years in this country.
Yeah, no, it's a radical departure, and that's what's led to the inflation. That's what's led to the price rises you're talking about. Just to use one statistic, you talked about, it gets harder and harder to be a homeowner, which something the average 28-year-old, 30-year-old used to be able to achieve with only 4 years' salary. The average house is now 20 years of salary.
Yeah.
And so the older generation who picked up their first house with the 4 years of salary is like, just work harder. It wasn't that bad. They don't realize how far it's departed from the 4 years of effort.
I give my parents a
20
hard
years
time.
of effort, right?
David, I give my
Which
parents
leads to all the memes online, about the boomers who are, bragging about the 5 strawberries they traded for their first house.
I give my parents a hard time. So Paul, you probably don't know this. I run a business in the mortgage space outside of the tech stuff that I work on, and I give my parents a hard time all the time because the average age of home buyers in, I think it was 1990, was born in approximately 1965. The average transaction today is being conducted by a person born in approximately 1965. And I was like, you guys have just been monopolizing real estate for the entirety of my life.
Well, I'll share 3 data points. So my wife and I got married in 1988. We had a daughter 10 months later, the very last day of 1988. So we're brand new parents. We bought our first house in 1990 for $59,000. And it was a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom townhouse. My parents bought their house that I grew up in for $29,000 in like 1970. My dad was a professor, but my salary when I started my first company and left my previous company, my salary was $18,000. So $59,000 for the house. $18,000, I think that's pretty close. I was less than 4 years of salary. And of course, I got it raised to $25,000, and then that house was very affordable. So yeah, the numbers suck. And the reality is really bad. But what's the cause of it? The cause of it is government regulation, government central planning, control of so many swaths of the economy, large decisions being made in Washington, D.C. or in our state capitals on trillions of or hundreds of billions of dollars of spending, and how are those going to be allocated? And, if you think about government contracting, it's so opposite of what the free market would do to solve problems. And so if all the oxygen's being sucked out of the free market, then those people that would have solved problems in the private sector or with nonprofits don't have the oxygen to do it. And so there's less and less dynamic creativity and disruptive innovation. There's more and more lethargy and sloth in how government responds to problems. It's just, I didn't ever go to Russia until 2019, but I remember going to Yugoslavia in the 1980s, late 1980s, and it was an East Bloc country as well. It was kind of, not in the Soviet bloc. It was trying to become more Western, but they were still a communist country led, I think, by Tito. There was no light in the faces of the people that I met with for a week. It was gray and drab and very depressing. And then I hopped on a plane from Belgrade from Dubrovnik to Belgrade to Frankfurt. I ran through the entire airport. My dad gave me a $100 bill, and I need to pay $100 to upgrade. I got the last first class seat on a flight to Atlanta. I got to Atlanta, and I saw people that were alive and happy and talkative. And I just wanted to kiss the ground in the Atlanta airport and hug the the ticket counter representative who was so sparkly and friendly because I had just walked out of a week on the streets of Yugoslavia, which was dead inside in a way. There was just no light or spark in people's faces and eyes. That's what communism does. And what free markets can do is give people the freedom to pursue their dreams and ideas and to create value for the whole world. And we've just got to promote that more and overcome the siren song of socialism, which is just going to lead to mass suffering again and again and again.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I do have a question for you guys. So kind of 2 points I want to make to preface this. The first being, I do think some of these things, well, okay, let me take a step back. We know that the pendulum swings with humanity, right? So whether it is the public zeitgeist on political opinions, whether it's Overton windows on any given topic that we might talk about, like the pendulum tends to swing. And there's also this horseshoe effect that happens. And I see it play out most commonly with liberalism. And when I say liberalism, I don't necessarily mean like the Democratic Party, but more just liberalism as a concept, where basically where your liberalism ends, someone else's begins. And so you have this effect where you eventually end up on the other side of the horseshoe from what's considered the liberal ideology of the day. This can also work in the other direction, though. And what I think a lot of people's concern is everything you just said about socialism and communism, I agree with. I've actually never once met someone who has spent any meaningful amount of time in like the Soviet Union or studying the Soviet Union who hasn't had a very similar, if not the same stance that you have. The concern on the other end of the spectrum, though, would be, okay, let's say that we did have a truly free markets, right? Like from a regulatory perspective, we still run into the issue of human emotions and human incentives and ultimately like greed. And so the other end of that spectrum is we end up with some type of like capitalist oligarchy where things still kind of they're elected officials, but they're not elected by votes, they're elected by dollars, right? Which is ultimately the same outcome. And so how do we get to some type of balance? Like, is it possible, in your opinion, to get to some type of balance? And like, what does it take to get that? Obviously, what that balance is will be endlessly up for debate, you know, depending on who you're talking to and what their priorities are. But is there even a way to get out of this huge flux, I guess is my question.
I mean, individuals are caught between the central planning government overreach, powerful interests that regulate or decide on most of the economy, and then these huge capitalistic corporations that have so much power, they're worth trillions of dollars, and literally billions of people use their products every single day. So that's kind of we're caught in between those two forces. And so David can certainly address the technological options that exist and that are spreading like crazy, decentralized intelligence, cryptocurrencies, and kind of stable, whatever blockchain and Web3 enable. But what I'm most interested in is the social political will that is going to be needed and the insights that will be needed to swing the pendulum back towards liberty and prosperity, away from those two most powerful modern institutions, the state and corporations. So I read a book by a journalist who wrote for The Economist magazine. It's a very good book. I highly recommend everyone read it. It's called The Company. I think he wrote it 10 or 15 years ago. And it tracks the history of corporations. Now, corporations really date back thousands of years, but the East Indies Trading Company, the Hudson Bay Company was created by the Crown, and corporations for hundreds of years were an act of parliament or an act of a monarch. And so the Hudson Bay Company at one point owned 10% of the land on planet Earth, all the timber and fur trapping rights for, Canada and much of North America. So Hudson Bay was a monopoly. So the Crown would grant these corporations monopolies. And India was filled with, these kinds of corporations that had monopolies. They had their own militaries and stuff like that. So modern limited liability capitalism started in the 1850s, and then it spread. And when my great grandfather was born in Illinois in 1842, he couldn't have formed a company that would have outlasted his own life. you could be a proprietor or you'd have a proprietorship, and then you would die and your children would inherit some of your property. But corporations are a modern construct. I've actually said before, and I believe this, what's the greatest invention in the history of modernity that's led to more wealth than any other invention? It's the invention of the corporation. So in overall, it's a very good thing. But what we've done is we've given corporations way too many rights. We have ceded way too much power to them, and we can take it back. When I say we, I mean we the people, through our elected officials, can slap hands or even chop off hands of corporations that are too greedy. Like, there's no reason why we can't. Well, there is a reason, because the big corporations donate huge dollars to the Democrats and the Republicans, and so they're kind of, like David said, 80% chance you're going to get your corporate lobbyist is going to be happy because you're funding both sides.
Yeah, well, this is the one party theory that I think a lot of younger America is subscribing to now, too, where it kind of doesn't really matter because it's ultimately like two sides of the same coin regardless. It's like, which color do you want to wear the next 4 years, red or blue, more than anything else?
Well, the funniest meme I've seen on X many times is where, NASCAR has its drivers with all the logos on it, and somebody has, doctored up members of Congress and members of the Senate, and they put, jackets on them with all their biggest sponsors, the millions of dollars of donations that come from corporations. Okay, so the thing is, knowledge that this is how things are can spread to tens of millions of people. Mm-hmm. And if we collectively say we've had enough of government making too many decisions and running too much of the economy, and corporations acquiring each other like crazy and becoming worth trillions, or we're going to have $10 trillion corporations soon. We might have a trillionaire on Earth soon. Okay, why? Because we, the people, through our elected representatives, created modern corporate law. And we allow corporations to do what they do. But what if we, the people, through our representatives, said, let's change what corporations are allowed to do? Instead of, oh, you can go acquire any of your competitors, and then 5 years later, we'll say, oh, there's a monopoly problem. We have allowed way too many acquisitions to happen, and companies get too big and too robust. And so I think it's hard to figure out how we're going to change that. But I actually have one concept I've been working on since 2015. And I think David and I've talked about this a little bit. But when Governor Martin O'Malley was the governor, Democratic governor of Maryland in 2009, the legislature passed a law for B corporations, public benefit corporations. It's the first time that concept had been created. And Governor O'Malley signed it happily. And I had dinner with him a few years later, and I got to spend 3 hours learning how this new type of modern corporation was birthed, a B Corp. And now we've seen the last few years DAOs, and Web3 enables all kinds of interesting cap table structures, governance and voting structures. They haven't been applied to government or democratic processes yet, but they could. But here's the thing. I think it's obscene that companies go public and they're owned by, partly by the public and then partly by the founders, and they create trillions of dollars of wealth for mostly for institutional investors. Mm-hmm. And the average non-sophisticated citizen had been locked out of the public markets since the 1934 Securities and Exchange Commission.
Well, Paul, they're protecting you. They're protecting you, right?
These unsophisticated dolts Yeah. But now in 2012, when President Obama passed into law the Jobs Act, and it took 4 years for the bureaucracy to say, okay, now we're serious. You can now crowdfund companies. Okay, 2016 till today, a few $billion has been raised. That's really awesome. But I think there's too little deal flow, really good deal flow for the average citizen. And the VC world and the private equity world and the Wall Street institutional investors, they get to buy up all the best assets and then have these economic engines that they own. Okay, well, what if there was a new type of a corporation, I've talked to some state legislators that are enthusiastic about this. But what if we created a type of corporation called a D corporation? And it's by design, it's massively distributed. Or you could even call it a democratic corporation in the sense that you can't have dominating shareholders in this entity. So the way I envision it, you can't take away the human incentive of risk taking for the early founding team, employees, and early investors. You got to reward risk. So you have a path for a D corporation to do what a C corp or an S corp or an LLC does. You take risks, you get investors, and then you go public. And there could be a time period or a dollar amount. If you're worth $1 billion or $5 billion, you go public. After you go public, you have an algorithm that prevents concentrated ownership. And there has to be a sale by all the big institutional or individual investors, including the founders, so that those that own 80 or 90% of the company have to sell those shares, and you end up with a massively distributed cap table. I imagine someday there could be $1 trillion corporation with 1 million shareholders, and they all have equal votes. You do a DAO kind of a voting mechanism. You get highly paid executives to run the company so that they, are doing it well. But I'm not saying this will replace C corporations or S corporations, but what if there was an option? I don't know about Bowen, if you know anyone. Most startup founders are kind of excited about the idea of becoming a millionaire, a multimillionaire, or someday a billionaire. Well, guess what will happen if you are a billionaire? You will have a hard time knowing who is your real friend and who just wants to, get part of your money. Even if you figure out a way because you had some real friends before you were a billionaire. But what about your kids and your grandkids? Yeah. It is almost impossible for the second, third, and fourth generation to not go completely off the rails. What entrepreneur with a great vision to change the world for the good would want to impose a burden of massive wealth on their children and grandchildren, which is almost unrecoverable from? It's almost like you're just going to suffer. You'll get into drugs and alcohol because you wake up and you're 18 and you're worth $500 million. What the heck? How are you going to navigate life? Like, it's going to be so artificial. And so what if we could build a D corporation that becomes worth tens of billions or hundreds? And then what if thousands of entrepreneurs start electing to become a D corp? And what if the tax benefits from our elected officials aren't to get Amazon's headquartered too into your big central, city, and you give them a $10 billion tax break? What if the tax breaks are designed by our legislators to go to the startups that have already elected to become a D corporation? Now, the inspiration for me in this whole D corporation journey is also in the UK. Have you ever heard of a company in the UK called the John Lewis Partnership?
I have not.
So I have not met anyone in the United States that's heard of the John Lewis Partnership. This is a company that's over 100 years old. They do $10 or $12 billion in revenue. They have 88,000 employees. They are all owners of this company. Why? Because John Lewis started a fantastic retail chain in the UK. He turned it over to his son, John Spedden Lewis Jr., and John Spedden Lewis Jr. grew the business, had 14,000 employees in the 1940s. And then I think he had a health issue or something, and he decided rather than own this company, he was going to give ownership to his 14,000 employees. So he formed a new corporate structure called the John Lewis Partnership, and every employee since then has owned shares in this company. And it's thrived for the last 80 years. What's interesting about John Spedden Lewis is he wrote a book about this that's literally the worst book I've ever tried to read. It's such a beautiful thing he did, but he wrote a book called An Experiment in Industrial Democracy, and it's the most unreadable tome I have ever opened up. And I tell people, why didn't anyone get inspired to do what he did? Because he couldn't communicate what he did. If he had given a 7-minute TED Talk in 1942, there might be 1 million entrepreneurs aspiring to be the next John Lewis Jr. So my thought is the pendulum needs to swing. New alternatives, both from technology infrastructure, Morpheus, Venice, all these awesome AI things. Of course, Bitcoin, Ethereum. By the way, I met Vitalik Buterin before he launched Ethereum. And I just have to throw this out there because I might sell this someday, and it should go in the Smithsonian, but maybe one of your listeners or viewers wants to buy this from me. I took a copy of Bitcoin magazine. Vitalik was the editor of it.
Yeah.
He used to be the editor of I had a copy of the issue where it had Ethereum on the cover, and his Ethereum white paper was in this issue. And this was before Ethereum launched. But I went to a hackathon in DC. I met Vitalik, and he autographed the copy of Bitcoin magazine that he had edited and that had his white paper.
Paul,
I've got his autograph.
I will be your buyer. Hang on.
cover.
Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second.
That's really cool, Paul. Yeah, no, it's fun, those early stories. I remember meeting Vitalik in Atlanta at the first Bitcoin conference that they held there. I think it was in 2013, and he was running the check-in counter.
This is like my prized possession. This is like my favorite item that I own, and it's the very first edition of Bitcoin magazine. It is not signed by Vitalik, but Vitalik did write it. And there was only like 1,500 copies or whatever it was in May 2012, and it is my favorite thing that I own. I have not had the pleasure of meeting Vitalik yet. David, all the Morpheus guys know I'm like a huge fanboy. I think unironically, Vitalik is like a great thinker of my generation, and he will go down as like just one of the greats in terms of just philosophy and technology.
100%.
People aren't going to appreciate for 80 years, but eventually they're going to look back and be like, that guy was pretty smart, huh? And I'll be like, yeah,
100%.
Yes,
he was 19 when I met him. And I know he was Russian speaking. He was from Canada. And I said, what's it like to be 19 and know that what you've done is going to completely change the world?
Totally.
And he was just humble, and he was nice. But yeah, I've got that autograph from September of 2014. Before Ethereum launched. But yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I've met Vint Cerf, who in 1968 with Bob Kahn created the internet in the first few, and now he's Google's global evangelist for the internet. I met Marc Andreessen, who invented the browser really as a student in Illinois. I met him at a conference. I met Dr. Eric Cooper, Eric Cooper, who invented the cell phone in 1973.
Wow.
I met him at a Wi-Fi conference in San Francisco. I haven't met Tim Berners-Lee, but yeah, Vitalik ranks up there as one of the greatest contributors to what the modern world is becoming. And it is amazing that I got to meet him early on and start watching, what Ethereum and smart contracts has done. And we're just scratching the surface of applications. I think the convergence of new technologies, including AI, and what you said, Bowen, about DIA, just agents transacting. Maybe that's why we've got crypto and stable. Like it's just like the transaction volume is going to be insane. And so we humans all will have a fleet of agents sooner or later. Some for our health and finance, some for managing our household, some for our work life. Now, I actually have a crazy big concept. I'll share it with you guys right now, and I'd love your thoughts on this. And it's really about the portability of your agents, okay? Corporations have a lot of power right now, right? So they employ you, and then they fire you. Jack Dorsey laid off 4,000 people. That became a thing to do. And so, we might see millions or tens of millions of people laid off. Now, do you guys know the company Degreed.com? It's a learning management platform. My friend David Blake, I say he's my friend, but I've only really spent a few meetings with him, but I really like him. We really hit it off quite well. He founded Degreed, and he wanted it to help people in the workplace who get a new skill to get a badge or a certification. And so his first customer was Bank of America, and they made a huge investment. So all Bank of America employees could use Degreed's learning platform and get skills and certifications. But it might be the only enterprise SaaS product in the world, it might be, that is portable and mobile, so that when you leave Bank of America, your Degreed account and all of your learning and badges comes with you. So imagine a future world. I just wrote a Substack article about a future where you go to a job interview in Chicago in 2030. on the Accenture 34th floor, and they're interviewing you for a very senior role for global supply chain management. And they sit down with you, and instead of asking you about your career, your resume, your skills, they say, David, tell us about your fleet. And you start describing the 25 agents that you've been training for 3 to 4 years. And then the question they ask is, do you own the fleet, and can you bring them to work with you? Bring your own agents, BYOA. Well, what
It sounds
if,
like right out of your brain, David. Yeah, I've heard. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Paul. I didn't mean to cut
no,
you
but
off.
what if all future employees have a set of agents, a fleet of agents, a swarm, a crew, and that they have trained them before they took the job? They use them on the job, plug them into the context and databases, but then when they leave the company, you know, Men in Black has that flash camera that blinks out your memory. What if your fleet of agents is portable, but you just wave the camera over it and it deletes the memory so that none of the corporate data leaks out? But the agents, the workflows, the skills, how it works with you, how each agent knows your personality and your strengths, knows how to communicate. Like, that optimal set of fleet of agents should be portable. And if this happens, employees will have 100 times more power in negotiating future labor contracts with employers than they do today. They're losing all of their leverage because AI agents will replace people. But if you come with 10 or 50 or 100 agents, you will be so hireable, employable, and so valuable, you'll command a lot of respect and value. But then when you leave that job, you don't leave your heart and soul with it. You get to bring it with you without the memory.
Yeah, that's how it has to be, right? For all the points you just made, if you don't have an agent, you know, your negotiation power goes to almost zero, right? Come in, do the thing, maybe act as an oracle, train our agents. The company owns the agents, and then thanks and goodbye, right? As opposed to, it's going to be something on your resume. It's going to be something that everybody expects you to bring into the job, just like you bring your phone or your laptop or your relationships or your experience from your career. You're going to have those agents that you own. And that's why I'm so happy about how this is playing out with open source agents, right? That open claw moment, and I think in January, cannot be sort of underemphasized in its importance, right? Because for the first time, I wasn't stuck in the corporate walled garden of Claude or OpenAI. It was something that lived on my machine, right? It's on my Mac Mini. I've got the data. I can plug in any model I want. And that really drives the competition, and it makes the monopoly you talked about earlier impossible, because that's what the AI companies wanted. In 23,
Right. Yes.
they were pushing hard for a government issued monopoly for 2 or 3 companies. Only we can be trusted with this powerful technology. But it would have meant that it would be impossible for people to move between those walled gardens. And today, those walls have been broken down, right? So whether it's, you know, using inference on Morpheus, or powering that into, you know, an agent that you're building on OpenClaw, or Hermes has really taken off recently as a flavor of OpenClaw. Now you've got a whole marketplace of people building these different implementations. The key is somebody can take it with them anywhere they go, right?
Yeah.
And so I can't, you know, say enough about how hooking up your friends and your family and the people you care about
Yes.
with these technologies early
Yes.
is the key, right?
Yes.
I spent a lot of time in 2012 after I found Bitcoin, just teaching all the people I really cared about, like, hey, this is going to be a capital explosion, you know, just get off zero, right? Take some exposure, learn about it, you know, get them in. And that had radical life change for people that I know that were working paycheck to paycheck that are now retired, right? And that is so rewarding. We're at one of those moments again where this intelligence explosion is happening, and your proximity to the explosion tells me everything about how much you're going to benefit. Because if you wait 2, 3, 4 years, there are going to be all these layers of abstraction, and it's going to be really hard to understand how it's really working. If if you're listening to this and if you take nothing away from this, get involved and just try it out and try to own one of these agents and leverage these technologies yourself, because that's going to have the biggest impact on your life the next 5-10 years for all the points that you're making, Paul. So
Well,
yeah,
and
I'm pretty optimistic. I think we're headed in a pretty good direction.
I do
right
too. I think the pendulum is going to swing back so fast that the corporations and the government won't even know what's happened before millions or tens of millions of citizens and normal people have been empowered with fleets of agents to change the dynamics of who knows what, and the government can't just pull things, the wool over our eyes, because our agents will keep track of what they're doing. But then our negotiating power with employers will go through the roof. And so we've talked about dystopian novels, Bowen, because you and I both, I did 8 dystopian novels one Christmas. It was a 2-week Christmas vacation. I went through Atlas Shrugged, Brave New World, 1984. But there's one I don't know if we've talked about. It's Kurt Vonnegut's first novel in, I think, 1952. It's called Player Piano. Have you guys read that?
No.
It's the first person who ever envisioned a future world, a possible future world, where machines made everything and humans were no longer employable. And so the player piano metaphor is the name of his book, because obviously a player piano plays itself. But the fascinating thing is he didn't have a conception of digital, but back then analog computers existed, and he had worked in a GE factory for 6 years. So he watched factories in operation. He knew there were really good press operators and drill operators and lathe operators. So in his analog world, his fictitious world, he imagined that the owners of the factory and the machines would watch the best lathe operator in the world for an 8-hour shift, and then build a machine that copied those motions and movements perfectly, but then could work, forever. And so as the player piano metaphor plays out, there are no people employed except like 10 people who own the machines that make everything. And I think it's shocking how close he was to what could happen if ownership of production of machines and robots and AI is in the hands of a few. Then what role is there for anybody else? But the opposite could happen.
Couldn't be more timely. You saw the news that Zuckerberg has told all of the employees at Meta they're going to keylog every single. This was this week.
Yes, I heard it yesterday on Tech Meme Ride Home.
That and train the AI on there. Like, what's your job security at Meta?
Well, and he's already got a 10% planned layoff coming, and I'm sure that will be followed by more and more and more, because a few AI could run the whole company. If it's not just the keystroke tracking and the mouse movements, it's also screenshots every time you're doing anything. So of course they're training AI to replace you. That's a really corporations that are very competitive and want to win at all costs despite the human toll. That we do have some leaders that are cut out of that cloth. But I think we have a lot more people that are like Jensen Huang, who are just very good human beings who want to make the world a better place. And he's trying to democratize. He's doing open source like crazy. Like he's doing all. Of course, he wants everyone to buy his GPUs, but they should own some GPUs and have their own fleet on their own hardware using an open source state of the art model. And then their own productive capability, their economic production power will be unlimited.
Yeah, so this actually brings up one of my favorite topics too, which is the idea of agent fungibility, or in other words, non-fungible agents. So the idea that I can take, I guess let's use Vitalik as the example, because we were talking about him before. If Vitalik has his personal set of agents and they're non-fungible, meaning there's a limited amount of copies that are exclusively verifiable as only existing in a limited quantity, what is the value of something like that? Like, what is the value of the, I don't know, name your favorite musician here, their agent that has access to all of their works that now can, like, I think that on its own will be its own market, is like the ability to actually pass down intelligence. Like we were talking even about ancestry, we were talking about genealogy before. what happens when I can actually pass down my intelligence to future generations and they can take it over, and now it's non-fungible, so they could, no one else will have access to it. Like that is such an incredibly powerful thing that will emerge, I think, from all of this as well.
I mean, that's a fascinating concept. If you think about life experience, reflection on experience, successes and failures, and then the wisdom that emerges, and even, I actually think one of the most fascinating concepts in the world of AI is that almost all human intelligence or wisdom can be captured as markdown files. Like, it's not a database that only engineers can read. It's like we're using Obsidian company wide now. We want every single note in the whole company, in the whole Obsidian vault, to be human readable and very agent readable. And if you load up an agent with too much memory or too much context, it ruins its ability to function. And so there's this really fascinating emergence towards simplicity. So the non-fungibility of wisdom is really interesting. I'm kind of more excited about take the lessons from your grandfather or grandmother who did something this way. It could be a recipe. It could be how they lived their life. It could be their maxims, and then capture that and distribute it to the whole family, or make it public, maybe. But that's a decision. You could have scarcity,
Sure.
and that would be powerful. You could also open source things or put it in the Creative Commons and hope that it, lifts all boats. But yeah, it's really interesting. My primary drive is to give every individual as much knowledge and empowerment as they can have, with no dependencies on outside entities to oversee or control what they do. Like, we just need to maximize human freedom to use intelligence in your own life, and get the positive benefits that come from it.
Yeah, completely agreed. This actually reminds me of an idea I had when I was in college, and I want to put it out there because I hope someone builds it. So please feel free to steal this if you're listening. When I was in school, I was thinking about how when people pass away, there are all of these just archived social media accounts, basically, and as well as camera rolls on their hardware. And they're basically just taking up server space and not really doing anything productive. And I was thinking about if someone could make a version of history that was archived based on people's first-person social media photos and posts and videos, and maybe even like their private photos and videos, you could have a completely different version of history. And I was thinking about this concept of how like history is written by the victors, and so it's those who survive that write the books. And I was like, well, what if it wasn't those who survived that wrote the books? What if I could have first-person accounts of all of the deceased, and I could now see, well, what was this event like from the perspective of someone who's sitting in the crowd recording it on their phone without necessarily even posting it online at any point in time? And I don't know, if someone can make this, I'd love if you did, because it'd be very cool.
Do you know, that reminds me of I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson who might have said that the only true history is biography or autobiography. And the reason is historians average thing. They talk to a lot of people, but the truth comes best when you see it through one person's lens. Like, I read a letter from Herbert Hoover from 1919 or 1920, before he was president, before he presided over the Great Depression, and all these camps were named Hoovervilles. If you've seen the movie Annie, or the play Annie, Herbert Hoover took the fall for all of the government's failures during the Great Depression. And thousands of towns and cities were called Hoovervilles, all the tent camps and stuff. And you know what? I read one letter that he wrote to Woodrow Wilson in 1919 or 1920. One letter changed my opinion of him forever. So he was a Republican. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. World War I had just ended. And there was a risk of millions of kids in Germany and in the Europe dying of starvation because of lack of infrastructure for food delivery. Well, guess who the best logistics operator in the United States was? Herbert Hoover. So Wilson hired him, and he oversaw food delivery of relief aid in Europe and literally saved millions of people from starvation. And he was persistent for years in finding food supplies, setting up distribution channels, and literally saving millions of people from starvation in Europe, because he was a logistics genius. And he was willing to, even though a Democratic president was in charge, he was willing to serve the country in that way. Later, he becomes the president. Sadly, after the 28-29 crash, he gets blamed for everything. It's so ironic that maybe the guy who saved more people from starvation post-World War I was blamed for the food shortages during the Great Depression. Just a sad irony. But one letter in first person, same with the Wright brothers when they were working on the airplane. I read a letter that they wrote as well. My oldest daughter bought me a subscription to famous historical letters. So once a week, I get a letter.
That's like the nerdiest thing ever. I love it. Oh man,
so awesome.
That's amazing. That's awesome. Yeah.
You read a letter from Albert Einstein, and it's like, now you get it. You get him. You get that situation. One letter is worth more than a textbook, in my opinion.
Oh, 100%. And I can't wait. I mean, think about in the future, like 40, 50, 100 years from now, people will be able to have conversations like this with agentic representations of people who lived today, and not just hear the letter, but actually like talk to them about it. You know, like that's so crazy. I think I've told you this before, David. So Paul, my father is a radio personality professionally. That's kind of what he does, and I have like thousands of hours of him doing radio, aging back to when he's in his early 20s. And I so badly at some point want to train an agent on all of that recorded footage so I can record my dad interviewing himself and like a younger version of himself. And I'm going to do it eventually. But think about doing that for everybody.
You know what? We have a pipeline right now. If you gave me 4,000 recordings, I would upload it. Within a few minutes, it'd be transcribed. It'd be vectorized. We could voiceify it, and you could actually do that. It's like a 10-minute lift for us. We have a whole
shoot! All right, I might take you up on that. I need to digitize a lot of it, but I seriously want to do it.
We take podcasters. We take YouTube hosts. We process thousands of their pieces of content. We give them a search interface to it. Then they can find a clip and share a clip. But you can also query past meetings or have a conversation with the whole data set. It's keyword searchable, it's vectorized, and it's actually something we did over 2 years ago. So it's super easy. I've got 20 people in the Philippines that could do this in 5 minutes.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
All right, I just need to finish digitizing all of it then, because a lot of it is hard copy tape.
Oh yeah, that's the hard part.
It was like from the 80s and 90s. Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, I will take you up on that, because I've been talking about doing this forever. But now, like, extrapolate that out to, again, like politicians, celebrities, anybody, and then that's kind of what I was saying too. I mean, I do hope people open source as much intelligence as possible, but the ability to own it privately gives you that choice. You're not just inherently selling it to the highest bidder and whatever centralized company. You can either choose for yourself, like, I want to open source this information, or I want, as an individual or a family or whatever it is, to profit from the thing, which is ultimately like what I've landed on for all of this stuff. Is I want whatever system and whatever systems get us the closest to the individual retaining liberty and value for themselves in the way that they choose to use it, which I hope they choose to use it in positive ways. Of course, that's like always the goal, but I know for sure having somebody else dictate that for me will not end up in a positive way.
That's right.
Just generally.
That's right. As humans, we instinctively want to make our own decisions and live our own life. And we're usually happy doing that until somebody else says you can't do that, or you don't have an option to do that. So I want to bring up one other interesting experience I had about 15 years ago. When the global financial crisis happened in 2008, 2009, I was really blown away by how fragile the global economic system is. I mean, it was risky. The contagion from the US spread all over. And, the more I learned about derivatives and, not just mortgage-backed securities, but derivatives and synthetic derivatives, and the hundreds of quadrillions of dollars of bets that had been made in the global casino, which the world calls the banking system.
Mm-hmm.
When Glass-Steagall was invalidated in 1999, when Senator Graham and President Clinton passed a new law that deregulated the derivatives industry and eliminated the distinction between lending banks, boring old banks, and investment banks, and allowed these huge banks to take, and JP Morgan's case, I think $2 trillion of $2 trillion of consumer deposits and lend almost about 10 billion a year to small businesses. But then they invest the other 1.99 trillion in derivatives or, foreign currency exchange or whatever. But the boring banking system was really important for the United States. Community banking, deposit banking and lending to small businesses. And when the 99 wall came down, and now big banks can have massive assets and they don't have to lend hardly anything. In fact, I think they just lend for theater. They just lend to appear to be a lending bank. But that to me is one of the worst things that's ever happened in our country's history.
The creature from Jekyll Island. I know you know that one. I asked David if he knew that one time, and I almost got laughed out the room. That was when we first met. Do you remember that, David? I was like, David, have you read this book? It's called The Creature from Jekyll Island, and you were like, yeah, I think I've heard of that one.
Yeah.
But no, you're exactly
one of the more famous books about the Federal Reserve. Yeah, I'd put the Federal Reserve going off the gold standard and breaking down because that difference you're talking about between investment banking and lending banking, because that's effectively fraud. Right.
Oh, yeah.
It's SBF all over again. Right. He was taking consumer money that they thought was theirs and they could withdraw. And he was even a good investor. Right. If you guys saw the recent, summary of all
yeah,
AI
it's crazy.
If only had held them, they would have done very well. But he wasn't supposed to use the consumer money that needed to be withdrawable for long-term illiquid investments. Right. And that temptation is just impossible for the banking system to resist. And so, the only solution in my mind is what cryptocurrency is doing, what Web3 is doing, is it's putting the private key back in the hand of the individual, right? And they become the ultimate self-sovereign holder of their wealth, right? And it's not fractionalized, and all these games aren't happening and being played. If you want to opt into the financial casino, you can still do that, and you're taking smart contract and other risk. But if you just want to hold it, which is what most people want, that becomes really easy, and you don't have these third-party dependencies. So the way I think about it is now there's $2 trillion of wealth that has opted into what are, in my view, strong property rights. Like, it can't be taken away by a regulator or a government or a corrupt official. If you've got the private key, it's actually your money, right? Because most of the use of cryptocurrency the last 15 years has been people in jurisdictions where they don't have good property rights.
Right.
And all of a sudden, they can take their wealth out of that corrupt system, right? Where it would have been confiscated or inflated away, right? Which is the most common fraud in the world is
right.
If you look behind me, I've got 100 failed government currencies hanging on the wall. And most of them are from the last 30 years, right? So, people have no concept that all of these currencies are constantly failing. It's just not the country they're in, right? And we're lucky in the US, we've only lost 98% of the value of the dollar since 1913.
That's my favorite chart, David. The dollar buying power, they'll turn it around soon.
Yeah. Any day now, it's going to start going back.
K-shaped recovery for sure. It'll be fine.
Think about the inflation even since the 60s and 70s, and the housing affordability could be like completely solved if we hadn't inflated away the value of the currency. Now, what I was going to get to, Bowen, based on your idea about historical figures and knowledge and wisdom from the past, during the great financial crisis, I wanted to understand, how did we get to now? And so I read about 40 books. I went to conferences. I watched every TARP debate on C-SPAN, and I studied like crazy. I met with a scholar in derivatives who used to work as a derivatives trader in the 80s. His name's Frank Partnoy. He wrote a book called Infectious Greed in 2002. He saw this crash coming. Warren Buffett's partner, Charlie Munger, saw this crash coming. So there were a few people besides the big short guy that saw it coming. But the one book that I found that was most fascinating, and I was so blown away by the insights from this book, I tried to call the family it's a book written in 1951, but I tried to call the family and get permission to digitize this book and get it to every member of Congress in the United States. Because if you are in the middle of a global financial crisis and the Secretary of Treasury says, give me an $800 billion blank check to bail out the crisis, well, he was at Goldman Sachs when they were selling derivatives all over the world. Mm-hmm. So, talk about the hen, the fox guarding the hen house, or whatever the metaphor is. So anyway, Mariner Eccles was the chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1934 till 1948. Okay, all the way through. And he had been a community banker in Utah, and his branches, I think his bank was First Security Bank. I think he had 28 branches from 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. Zero depositors lost any money. Nobody lost a penny. They had runs on his branches, but he used techniques and psychology to stave off the runs. So It's a Wonderful Life, the run on the bank, did not happen. He solved that. He caught the attention of FDR because in 1933 he started going to Washington. Pretty soon he was brought in from Utah to become the chairman of the Fed for 14 years. And so he watched the Depression. He watched what the government, U.S. government, tried to do, the Treasury, the Fed. And if you wanted to channel one historical figure to provide the insights that he would have had about what worked and what didn't work to get us out of the Great Depression, it would have been Mariner Eccles. No question about it. The family would not give me permission to duplicate the book and try to bring his, decades-old insights to our modern political class. And I was super disappointed.
Why not? What was their reasoning for that?
They actually had a reason that there was either his request or maybe a family member's request to not duplicate it. There might have been some errors in it, or maybe there was some regret about what he said about people. I don't know, but they wouldn't give me permission. Frank Partnoy signed 30 copies of his book, Infectious Greed, that I sent to Washington, D.C., because I thought, if you could take Frank Partnoy's book on predicting the collapse from derivatives trading, and then Mariner Eccles' insights about the 15 years where we were trying to get out of the Depression from 34 to 48, those two kind of intellectual geniuses would provide the knowledge that our current elected class would need to do the right thing. So I didn't succeed in that regard. But there are people on Earth who know the truth about super important things. And there's a very few of them, and that could be on policies that work or policies that fail. There's a lot of intelligence that's common, that, people know how to cook and share recipes and stuff like that. But some of the world's infrastructure and some of the most important things, only a handful of people know the truth. And so I think that knowledge needs to be more widely disseminated.
Yeah, totally. Well, and a mutable version of that knowledge as well.
Yes.
So that, and that's the big thing. This is something, so I did a video, I need to do more of these, but the climate at the time was not great. I did a video where I was standing out in public with a sign that said, "Talk to me about AI." And I was just having people come up and talk to me about their thoughts on artificial intelligence and trying to Morpheus pill them into decentralized AI. And it sparked all of these conversations because there is a negative connotation that a lot of the public has with AI just generally. And I totally understand why. But the things we are working on, it's one of those things where I look at it like the general you are going to benefit from the things that we and people like us are building. And I'm happy about that, even if you hate me for it. And like you're going to be mad, you're going to hate it, you're going to kick and scream the whole time, but we're going to build this freedom tech and you're going to benefit for it because it's for the greater good. And that's amazing. But that's also why things like this need to be immutable, so that when they get put out there, they're out there, and other people can pick up the torch and carry it. And I say we building, I'm more of just a user, and I talk about the really cool things other people build. But it's that's the way forward, in my opinion, and like the only way forward.
Yeah. I love the science fiction author William Gibson's quote about, he said, the future's already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And I actually think that happiness and flourishing is also already here, but it's just not very widely distributed. And success is already here, but it's not very widely distributed, depending on your definition of success. So one of the things that I hope to see happen with our AI studio and with the launch of fleets of agents for authors, fleets of agents for real estate professionals, sales leaders, anybody will have a fleet of agents. You'll be able to, come to SOAR and decide what your fleet's going to look like and start paying. And the goal would be to have your local open source LLM, when Olama can be on your desktop or your laptop with a good model that can run your agents, then you don't have to pay any cloud provider for running that intelligence. You'll just have unlimited access to agents going to build your life. But as those things happen, I think more and more people will realize that hallucinating agents, that ChatGPT, making mistakes and stuff, that's their perception of what AI is. Mm-hmm. When you have 5 or 10 agents helping you succeed financially, or in one case, we're letting out a fleet of agents for authors. Okay, millions of people wish they could write a book, and they, like me, I've started 17 books. I haven't finished a single one. So when I write the official history of Ancestry.com, I could write it by going through my archives of 20 boxes of materials for the first 7 years. I know all the plans. I know all the people. I was involved in almost all the meetings. But then I realized that my 50 early colleagues in Ancestry.com all had different experiences than I did. So we built a product called AuthorFlow. I dial up all these 50 people, interview them each for an hour, and now I have 50 hours of transcripts of my colleagues who all saw and experienced different things than I did. And then I outline the chapters of the book, and the AI deep research superintelligence writes the first draft, but quotes from all the people who had really important experiences. Then I publish my book. But then we'll have a fleet of agents for authors to go promote your book everywhere the topics are being discussed, genealogy message boards and email newsletters and little short video clips that are AI generated. And maybe I'll sell 10,000 extra copies of the book because of my fleet of author agents. So yep. when tens of millions of people get economic and health benefits because they have a fleet of agents helping them live their best life, people's perception of AI will go from mostly negative to, I can't live without it. And I want to share this like David does with all my family, with all my friends, people I love and care about. They need to be empowered with their own fleet.
Yep, 100%. Well, and I think one of the big breakthroughs is going to be as soon as my agent can do that interview of their agent, right? Because doing 50 interviews and running through 50 hours might take months. But if they've got an agent that's pretty well trained, like you're saying, it's got Obsidian, it's got all those markdown files, it has a pretty good map of that experience, you're still going to want a review of it, but that might get you 90% of the way there, right? I think about all these meetings I have, I'm getting them transcribed, I'm getting them summarized. Here's all the action items. But then, why should I be blocked on next steps until a week later when I have the next meeting? And, oh, did you finish that? And did you finish that? No, I want my agent to be collaborating with my colleague's agent the next minute. As soon as the meeting is done, next 3-4 hours, they could potentially have all of our action items knocked out. And we should have another meeting tomorrow, because the only bottleneck is now, what do we want our agents to do, right? That's been the amazing thing for me the last 4 months, is I can now effectively get things done as fast as I can describe to my agent what I want to accomplish and polish those outcomes, right? The getting the thing done is no longer the bottleneck. It's people figuring out what they want to accomplish and being able to actually articulate that to their AI, which is an amazing place to be. And to your point, makes the humans much more valuable. Like if you had an engineer that could build, one website a week or build one software product every 3 months, and all of a sudden they can churn out 10 times as many, right? Like that engineer is now is creating 10 times as much value in the world, as long as what they're bringing is something that they still have power in that negotiation, like you talked about with the company. I think that's going to be the key. And And we're going to see, I think, a shrinking of team size, but we're going to have a lot more flexibility as people can move in and out of these roles. I mean, we've gone from the average person working a career for 20 years to 10 years. I think the average now is 2 years per position.
Yeah.
If you go to other economies like China, the average is 1. People think and they sit down at the Chinese New Year every year. Where do I want to work this year? And they have no presumption that it's going to be the same place that they worked at last year. And a lot of the studies have shown if you're willing to change up your role and where you are, you do better economically than the person that sort of stagnates and is willing to sort of sit in that same role for 5 or 10 years. So I think that's the reality that we're going to see play out here.
Well,
I
this
like
kind of
that
lends
you-
it.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. Go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say, I like that you brought up transcripts of meetings, because think about pre-COVID, we almost never did Zoom calls and Google Meet. We were just in person. And then COVID shut down the world. And then everybody, like the next year, 2020, probably more university courses were streamed online and more knowledge was transmitted digitally, 100 times more than any previous year in human history. And now, since most corporate workspaces are either remote or hybrid, so many things are said and done and recorded. And to your point, David, my COO just worked with my head of AI, because we're doing a 90-day launch plan. So any corporation can spin up a fleet of agents for every employee within 90 days. And the first 30 days is recording all your calls and meetings, and then analyzing all the tasks you talk about doing, or all the things all the goals you have, everything that's expected of you. And then the fleet of agents is designed starting on day 31, and then it starts to do self-improvement loops. But so by the time 90 days is up, the last 30 days is show and tell and kind of change management, so that all humans in your enterprise become very good at sharing their best agents and workflows with other colleagues, so that knowledge spreads. So it's but she found there are 17 agents that are going to be built for her fleet based on her 30 days of meetings, her last 30 days of meetings. And one of them was unexpected, like a brand IP check, because we're naming new products all the time, and we didn't have anyone on the staff that's going and doing a trademark check on all these new brands. And so we found several contracts. She brought that up in 4 meetings. So now there's a brand agent to go check on trademarks before we make a decision on what to launch the product, what name to call it. And so the thing is, since humans talk a lot and we record a lot of it, the agents can be derived from, your fleet of agents can be derived from 30 days of conversations. But to your point, when you can precisely and clearly articulate what you want to bring into existence, it will happen. I'm a person of faith, and I've been saying for about a year as I speak about AI that I actually believe there's a loving creator. He created the universe. He designed us to inhabit it, and his goal is our happiness and joy. And you know, so he actually is an all-knowing, all-powerful being. And so I'm not worried about AI being an existential threat, because if you listen to the book of Daniel, you'll know that there is a God in heaven who reigns, and that rulers of Babylon or Egypt or nations, cannot control the outcomes. He's in charge. Benjamin Franklin talked about a divine providence that oversees all nations. And so I believe that's God. But one of the godly powers that humans are now able to experience, first of all, procreation is the greatest miracle, I think, in the world. I've had 8 children. My wife has had 8 children. I just did a small part in bringing those children into existence. But she spent 9 months nurturing their physical bodies. And the miracle of birth is so profound to me. When you see that little child take their first breath and you realize that you created life, there is nothing more powerful than the love that you feel. And it lasts forever, and it grows stronger and stronger. There's nothing I wouldn't do for my kids or my grandkids. I saw a tweet about a month ago. There was an Asian man who has a little girl. I think she was 9 months old. She had a fatal brain tumor. And he said in this little tweet, "Where is the button I can push to sacrifice my life to instantly heal my daughter?" No parent would not push that button instantly. Okay, so there's nothing more powerful in the world or in the universe than the love that a parent has for a child. The other godly power that we're all able to start experience is God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and we can now experience speaking things into existence in a way that's never been possible before in human history. Right now, digital existence, but when you have a fleet of robots, you can tell them to go do your garden. You could give them precise instructions on what to plant and where. And a day later, you've got a garden that will feed your family for the next year. Like, speaking things into existence is becoming possible for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it lends itself. So, are you familiar with Elon's idea of like universal high income, like this
Yes,
idea
I've been
of,
following that.
yeah, I was gonna say it kind of is a similar line of thinking there, and actually, I think some version of this is how this will play out. My opinion on this is that special interest groups, or as like Balaji would call them, nation states or network states rather, will arise based on the shared values and shared really it's values, but like things that people care most about. And through those things and through the collective intelligence that can then be like ultimately monetized or used to create resources, those resources can be redistributed through those groups to the people who seek them. And this is like kind of taking the ownership of intelligence. It's taking something like a DAO structure. It's taking something like a special interest group, whether that be a church or an industry, or I mean, really, it could be anything that people decide to agree upon, whatever the terms are. And that is, I think, how we get to that concept in practice of like universal high, I would just call it like high standard of living, basically. Is that someone's protected by someone else somewhere, but it's opt-in. It's not based on, force, basically, which is how I would describe our current, tax system and other similar things.
My preference is that rather than organizations enabling that to happen, my preference is that individuals own some property, they own their own compute, their own electricity generation, they own their own little fleet of agents and robots, and that the universal high income is from their own, words and their own commands, rather than, I worry about the strings that will be attached to any UBI or UHI check from any organization. Like,
Yeah.
who's gonna say, oh yeah, for 2 years you're gonna get this, but then we want you to do this in order to get the check. Like, so, but you're right. It could be decentralized in a collective kind of a goodwill. But if it's reversible, if strings can be attached later to that check, then I think we might be ceding our future liberty for, ease and convenience now. And I actually think, I studied a lot about African Americans and the slave trade, the Atlantic, the horrific 366-year history. Because of Ancestry.com, we could only go so far in helping African Americans, go pre-Civil War. DNA testing has helped many people trace back to the continent, but there are many long-term effects from the multi-generational trauma that population went through. And I've met with so many people who have great attitudes about the freedom that they ended up getting, but then there's still trauma, and there's been discrimination for many decades, and so when I think about what was promised to the 4 million freed black slaves in the United States, 40 acres and a mule was the promise. And Booker T. Washington, if you ever listen to his autobiography, it's the most inspiring autobiography I've listened to in my entire life. I was absolutely in tears with this incredible human being's life story, his arc from being raised where it was illegal to teach him how to read, but someone broke that rule, taught him how to read. He got into education, became the greatest educator in the African American community for decades. He gave a speech in Atlanta that all the leaders of the nation came to. He was the first great leader in the African American community. But the 40 acres and a mule promise was completely broken. And I think most people don't know this in American history, but I bought a book about all the black members of Congress and the Senate in 1865 to 1872. For 7 years, I think there were 14 or 15 people elected. They served as representatives in Congress. Then there were no black people elected to public office in the United States Senate or House for 100 years. Okay, gerrymandering, voter suppression. There needed to be a civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. There was so many disadvantaged populations, segregation, Brown versus Board of Education, all these things. And so history has happened, and there's a lingering trauma on many communities. And it really hurts me that the 40 acres and a mule promise that the U.S. government made was not kept. Mm-hmm. And so it feels to me like that there's an opportunity. I call decentralized edge intelligence the new DEI. Okay, the recent DEI, which has really faded with ESG, was an attempt to lift populations that have been historically disadvantaged. But what happened was it was tearing down the other populations who had merit, but were not given an opportunity. For example, I've never been on a publicly traded company board, and so in 2022, I thought, hey, I founded Ancestry. I think I'd be a good board member for a publicly traded company. So I put my hat in the ring. I submitted a resume. I did a $3,000 professional resume. I thought it was great. I called a recruiter who's been placing CEOs and board members for 28 years, and he literally laughed me in the face. He said, Paul, you're a white male in your 50s. There's no way I can put you on a board of directors right now. There's no room for you. Okay, now I didn't really mind that because, I didn't need the board seat. I would have wanted one. But DEI is only good if it lifts the disadvantaged and doesn't tear down people that might be advantaged. What I think about decentralized edge intelligence is everybody could have 40 acres and a mule. Everybody could have intelligence at their fingertips to live their best life, make good career choices, make fantastic financial decisions, stop paying dumb taxes because you don't know something about something, so you overpay, or you don't understand how to get an accountant to save you money on taxes. You don't know you should move to Puerto Rico or whatever. But the thing is, intelligence at your fingertips could maximize your health, your finances, your social relationships, your role as a citizen, your service in the community. You could find the needs and meet them. And everyone deserves that kind of DEI, which raises everybody and doesn't tear anyone down.
I like that. That's a cool vision. And, to go back a little bit to the point you made earlier about governance, just to brag on Texas, it's such a unique governance system where they only have a legislative session every 2 years, and they only actually set a budget every 4 years. So they have to be very conservative. And for some reason, that's led to this big surplus every 4 years because, they sort of are very fiscally responsible, but also they only pay $100 to representatives in Texas. And so
$100? That's their salary?
2 years, because there are no professional politicians. They get together for a month once every 2 years. It's not a job. 90% of the Texas politicians are business owners, entrepreneurs, or folks that are investors. And so as a result, they don't do things like income tax and capital gains and all the rest. And so, there's a huge advantage to having people who have a diverse background of actually building things. And they tend to align more towards, policies that are really, successful. So, I think it was Thomas Jefferson that said the government that governs the least governs the best. And I think that's really true, right? So there's one side where you want them to understand good policy, and then there's just another side where I don't need them sitting in the Capitol every day imagining new policies. How about we just pick some policies and they're going to be the same for the next 2 years because there's nobody sitting there. And so it's funny when people talk about Austin, they often say, oh, well, it's the seat of government. It must be a government town. I was like, nobody talks about politics here. Like, there's no politicians sitting in that building. Like, the only one there is like the governor and the executive branch, right? There's not a legislature just permanently installed. And so I think you got one of two choices. You mentioned the Singaporean model earlier, which is pay them well and have that be all legit compensation. not the temptation of corruption, or pay them almost nothing and is literally public service, but they only show up once every couple of years and it's like an honorary thing. I think those are the two models you want. You don't want to be in the middle where they're not paid enough to actually do the thing, but they're expected to actually have a job as a politician, which they end up just focusing on accruing power or get reelected or whatever else. You and I talked about this historical happenstance a little bit when we were hanging out at a conference, but are either of you guys familiar? We talked about the proportionality amendment. This is a little thing, a little, sidetrack in history where during the original amendments, the ideas there would be one representative for every 25,000 citizens. And that was going to increase a little bit, but they were going to cap it at 50,000 people per representative. And unfortunately, 8 out of the 9 required states got their paperwork in, but I think it was the paperwork for Delaware. One of the states got lost and it never showed up at the ratification.
But that was the first bill of the Bill of Rights. That was even ahead of the free speech and freedom of religion. Yeah. That was supposed to be the first.
That was going to be the amendment of the first and proportionality amendment. And it's so a critical thing because that would have created this direct connection between okay, how many people can you really represent? And so in the 1900s, Congress arbitrarily capped the number at 435. There's nothing in the Constitution about that, right? Congress just said, well, 435 seems about right.
Well, the whole point for the decade census every decade was to decide how many more seats to add. And in 1910, they didn't add any. In 1920, in 1940, they made the 435 permanent. But that completely ruins the proportion of representatives to citizens.
So now it's 700,000 people. Most people have never met their representative.
Oh, yeah.
And so, it's too bad, but it hasn't expired. There's no expiration on this amendment. If somebody went and got enough additional states, it would actually get added to the Constitution, which would be really interesting because you would then, I think it would take the number of representatives to 7,000 people in Congress. And what a shakeup that would be if we actually had not just 90% lawyers who live in DC, but people from all walks of life that actually do have thousands of different expertise.
I was going to say, David, I didn't know. I have not heard of that. That is one of the best ways forward for a third party that I've ever heard of to actually interject some diversity of opinion and diversity of resources.
It's so fun that David told me that we had both mutually separately found that historical fact. Me, because of genealogy and decades research. There's a nonprofit in DC called Build a Bigger House, and they're trying to advocate for that. Here's the problem. Because I love the idea. I would love to have thousands of people who have different occupational tracks, different expertise. They're going to govern a lot better, and they wouldn't be professional class politicians trying to get into the leadership roles in DC. Here's the problem. Because the United States citizenry has such distaste and distrust for our elected officials, they will say to you, Bowen, the last thing I want is 7,000 members of Congress.
Yeah, I actually do agree with that.
I can't stand the ones we've got. So why do we want 7,000 more? My argument is you will know your neighbor is your representative. That will change everything. They'll come and knock on those 50,000 doors or 20,000 households. Every single person running for House in the U.S. House of Representatives who is supposed to be in charge of budget and spending, they would know you and you would know them. I think that would be the most refreshing change in our lifetimes.
When you put it that way, I definitely agree. I also do see the other side, though, of the argument people will make. This is also how I think something to this effect, how we get to agentic politicians, which I do think is realistic at some point down the line. But also, I was talking to somebody else, I can't remember who it was, about something similar pretty recently, and I was pointing out that this is the only time in history that I can think of where you have, I don't know what the average age in Congress is right now, but it's got to be 70 or close to it, maybe, and rising. And I was like, only now do you have this class of people who would typically be, and I don't mean to be morbid, but just the reality, sunsetting, basically, as humans, making the decisions for the working class, the people who are out there working. This would never happen 500 years ago. I mean, they would just be like, "Oh, this group of like elderly people is making decisions against my will. Well, I know where they live. They live in that castle, so we're gonna go get them." And I'm not advocating for like any type of like physical violence or anything like that. I'm just saying we now live in a world where it's set up where like it's even possible to have this level of control and power without any of the responsibility and any of the accountability is really the word that I'm looking for.
I thought one of the other interesting proposals was to give votes to children and have their parents delegate those votes until they hit 18, because of the dynamic right now is only the older population vote. 4 out of every $5 in the federal and state budget go to the elderly. And 1 out of the 5 goes to primary education and all these other things. And it's like so imbalanced, but that's how the votes work. The younger people literally have no weight in the system.
Yeah.
So why have a big family? Why have a bunch of children? You will be economically penalized for doing that, right? They're going to take your wages and give it to somebody else. And so even though, you would hope the grandparents would vote for the benefit of their children, the politicians are out there lobbying for grandma's benefits.
It's just not how people work.
Grandchild,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
my version of this, David, is it's similar, but it's taking so if the voting age is 18, taking in any given election the average life expectancy and subtracting 18 years, and that's the last year you get to vote. So you're 18 years on either end, basically. And it's wildly unpopular. My parents looked at me like I was a crazy person when I proposed this. But it's for the same reasons, though, is that like I just want a system where we're looking down the line and not just continuing to kick the can, which is ultimately what we're doing.
It's really, really sickening that the $39 trillion debt and the $1 trillion of interest, that both parties just keep doing that. The thing that I hadn't heard about the children getting the right to vote, that's fascinating. I'll have to think through that. But the one that really bothers me is gerrymandering by parties in both parties at the state level. And that's why unpopular politicians always win re-election. So you might get a Gallup poll that has 12% or 14% congressional approving, and then a 92% re-election rate of incumbents, because the districts are carved up so that they're a safe Republican or a safe Democratic district. 80% of Americans' right to vote doesn't really matter because you're in a gerrymandered district and your vote is not going to matter. There's just a number of swing states or swing zone districts of congressional races that are truly competitive, but both of the parties have fallen prey to like the thought of like, we're in power, let's keep it. So the gerrymandering is ruining representative government.
Paul, can I? Sorry.
I want to make one last point here. So there's voting, the imbalance, and the gerrymandering. There's the aspects of proportionality talked about. The last one is the intent of the U.S. Constitution was most things wouldn't be up for laws to be created about, right?
Correct.
There were certain enumerated powers.
19 enumerated powers.
Yeah,
here's
the list. That's it, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, my take is 1913 happens. The abomination that is the income tax gets in, and all U.S. law starts flowing through the income tax because it's not a healthcare law, it's a tax law, right? And they just reframe everything as penalties or taxes, and the U.S. government bloats to become a regulator of all parts of life, way beyond the enumerated powers.
100%, but in the same decade, the direct election of senators took the senator from representing the state legislature. The state legislature used to vote for the U.S. Senate, those 50 or 100 members of the U.S. Senate. It used to be the state legislature. So they were representing the state and the state's rights. So yes, the income tax gives the federal government as much money as they want. And now the senators are pretty much lifers and they work in the federal government and they don't really need to report back to their state legislatures. If the federal government usurps 90% of what the states used to do, nobody's going to fight it.
Yep. And just to tie it all together, I think what we're building changes the equation because most government power and government power the last few hundred years has been offensive. I don't know if you guys have nerded out on this theory, but there's some good thought leaders on this subject that point out like the age of castles ended the moment artillery was invented.
Yeah.
Right, your castle walls didn't matter as soon as artillery was invented. Nobody was building castles anymore. All that mattered for centuries after that, all the way up to the atomic bomb, right, was massive centralized power and the ability to destroy, right? But what has changed with cryptography is they can't figure out where to point the gun. Like, how do you stop this Bitcoin thing? Where's the person in charge, right? But it's math, right? So you can just validate it yourself. There's no group of people that you can take down. Like the Chinese kicked out the Bitcoin miners. Bitcoin network didn't care. It kept on churning. The miners moved to Texas and the transactions continued to flow. And so the one perspective of this is where the pendulum is swinging back. And there's now 100% effective defense of your ability to hold that property that doesn't need you to have an offensive because the math is such an effective shield, right? This is changing everything, right? All of a sudden, those capital controls the government thought they could put on their citizens and they can't send money anywhere, those capital controls don't matter. Anybody with an internet connection and a crypto wallet can send their brother, in the developed world money, whether the local government likes it or not, right? And so what it's going to do is it's going to unravel, I think, so many of these presumptions. I think income tax is going to become effectively impossible to track or meaningfully enforce. I think the same is true of capital gains. Like, how do you know how much money the agent made? Like, it's off spinning, in its virtual machine and interacting with other agents. And there's cryptographic privacy for all of that. I think it's going to revert a lot closer to the Texas model where you have sales tax and property tax, which are a lot closer to the actual person and the actual infrastructure they're getting provided, and not these abstract, complex, behemoths that have been built around income and capital gains and trying to extract as much abstract value to what fund the war machine or fund something else I don't want to fund. Like my local roads, I'm fine with that, right? And so I think that recentering of things around this defensive model is really interesting. So if you can own your money and you can own your intelligence, you've got a personal castle, right? We're seeing the reemergence of a self-sovereign person that all of a sudden has a lot more leverage, not just with their employer, but with the state, right? And they can choose to move their wealth where it's best respected.
Have you seen,
that's
David,
beautiful.
just reminded me, have you ever seen that meme of, it was from early on, it was a couple years ago, I think it was when Iran or somebody was shooting missiles over to Israel and they were using the Iron Dome, and it had my tax dollars next to the Iron Dome, and then it had also somehow my tax dollars on the missiles flying right towards it.
Yeah.
That's what it just made me think of. But the concept, I mean, it's very much in line with the sovereign individual idea, right? Like the idea that we now have the ability to separate value from the state, where we never really did in a way that was had all of the core values of money, right? Divisible, transferable, immutable, verifiable. And I think what you just said is what's going to happen is we're going to get to a point where the individual will be once again more valuable to the state than the state is to the individual, and so they will have to make concession to keep the value in their borders, as opposed to having it inherently trapped in their borders. What's his name, Jack Ma, just like goes missing sometimes. Like, that's not going to be at least allegedly, that's not going to fly in a decade when most of the billionaires are holding their value in Bitcoin or Ethereum or more or something like this, where it doesn't have those same values that the nation state can control.
Well, this is a good time to bring up something that should have been highlighted more in Dallas. It wasn't, but in October it will be a feature of the new big gathering we're doing, Citizen Portal, Open the Books, AI and the Future of Freedom. We'll do another big conference, and Utah has a head of technology and privacy. He works with the Utah executive branch. His name's Christopher Bramwell. And last year, the Utah State Legislature unanimously voted in favor of something that's really fundamental to human rights in the future. And that is, it's called the State Endorsed Digital Identity Act. So government should not issue your identity. You don't get your rights from government. Those are inalienable rights endowed by your creator. So your humanity and your rights pre-exist the government, the construct of a government. But the government that you have to interact with needs to endorse the identity that you already have. So the Chris Bramwell's approach is being promoted to many other states. And if all 50 states will pass legislation that says the state can endorse your digital identity that is proofed or certified from some other thing, it could be biometric, it could be whatever, but you as a human exist outside of the state's, saying you have a right to exist, just like the state can't give you freedoms and then take them away. It can't give you an identity, a digital identity. So Chris Bramwell has been working on this for years. He quotes the founders all the time. I just love the movement that he's building, but I think it ties in really nicely to what both of you just said about self-sovereign. We each should have our castle. We should have our money and our intelligence and our protection and safety, but we have to interact with government. So we want them to endorse our digital identity so that we can transact with them.
And give you a cool real world example of this. I did this a few years ago. Is one of the first jurisdictions in the world, Palu, came out with a digital identity. And you could basically submit some documents and to prove, yep, I'm me. And they would give you this card that was backed by a Web3 credential, right? So it was connected to a private key and an address that I owned, and it had a zero knowledge proof, right? And I would carry this thing around with me. And it was funny, I was living in Puerto Rico for 3 years. And for whatever reason, my Puerto Rican driver's license would always break at the TSA line. Like they put it in the machine, didn't work. I would pull out my Palu ID and it worked in the TSA machine.
Whoa.
Better than my Puerto Rico issued driver's license in the government's own system. And so I thought that was so hilarious. And I think that's a great example of where it should go is like, okay, if I own my identity, they can recognize it if they want, but it exists outside of their system, which is the Uno card reverse of like the government's going to issue a digital identity to everybody, right? Which is the whole credit system that nobody wants to live under, because as soon as they issue the credential, they can take it away.
Yeah.
This
Was
also
Michael
sounds like
Proper
abolishment of DMV, which I'm all in. Let's do it.
Was Michael Proper, was that Palu part of the Clear approach? He's gone to a lot of sovereign nations, the islands, the Polynesian islands, and he's doing some Web3 things. It sounds a lot like what you just described.
Yeah, he might have been involved in the company. I'd have to look up which one sort of partnered with the government to create that. But it was pretty cool. I think the program is still ongoing. A bunch of people in Web3 got their credentials, so then they could open exchange accounts, because a lot of exchange accounts wouldn't take a US ID for sort of the 10-year period from 2014 to 24, right, when there are all the draconian rules about US access to those international, and so people would get an ID from a different country. So I thought it was a really cool solution, and it was sort of really ahead of its time. But that we need that, but for everybody, and then I think we're on a good path. Then you've got your identity, you've got your intelligence, you're able to hold honest money that can't be inflated by politicians. And to your point, Bo, that's going to put a lot of pressure on the Fed and others to lower inflation, because if I'm 2 seconds away from swapping my money into Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever else I want, like I don't have to hold their dollars, right? In the same way that I really did have to, before these things existed. Though I would say the thing now, really propping up the dollar is stable coins. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you guys have seen the statistics, but I think it'll cross $50 trillion this year in stablecoin volumes. I mean, Visa did 16 trillion last year. So we're at like 3x the volumes of Visa between Tether and USDC, and it's primarily people using it internationally as a euro dollar. I don't know if Bo, if you're familiar with the euro dollar system, but like European banks that couldn't issue, but they could, hold dollars on deposit and give somebody a receipt, right? And people started using these as euro dollars. That's effectively what's happening with stablecoins, because most people don't want, the Nigerian lira or whatever. Like these are not great currencies. They tend to, run 10 to 20% annual inflation, right? And like Argentina, right? It was more than 100% at one point, right? So,
well, and that's just domestically. That's not even comparing it to the other currencies, right? Yeah. So that's
David, the chart or the poster on the back of your wall with 100 currencies. Have you personally collected those? Did you buy those off eBay, or did you buy this poster already filled out nicely with those 100 examples?
I built the poster. It was as easy as $100 on Amazon to get the collection, because most currency devalues to the value of the paper it's printed on. I probably paid 10x more than those currencies, like the $10 trillion Zimbabwe bill I've got in my collection. Belarus has had 3 currencies since the fall of the wall. So like every 10 years, they've got like little squirrel money looking currencies. Like none of these have any value because they're not backed by anything, right?
Yeah.
Remember when Nixon famously temporarily suspended the gold standard in 71 because he ran out of money to pay for the Vietnam War, and the French were knocking on the door. They'd like their gold out of Fort Knox. No, we're not.
I was going to say, David, it's still in Fort Knox. We just can't go check.
Yeah, I think it was what, 35, 37 bucks an ounce.
Yeah.
Was the price of gold in 71. And so like gold hasn't radically changed. It's still the yellow lump of metal that it was in 71. That gives you an idea for how far the inflation has gone since then, because we should be in this golden age of everything getting cheaper.
Yes.
Robotics and software and computers have massively increased human productivity in that period. But in that 50 years, the middle income folks have experienced no difference in their standard of living in 50 years. So what's happened is the banking system has effectively absorbed all of those productivity benefits and handed them to people that have access to that cheap capital. If you're at the Fed window at 2%, 3%, it used to be at 0% for a lot of the last decade, you got the free money printer. And to your point, Paul, the banks just became T-bill buyers. They can get free money from the Fed on one side and hand it to the Treasury on the other side, collect the difference. They don't have to do loans anymore.
Oh, yeah. Well, and they also
about
can't
loans.
fail.
Like, loans aren't important.
I mean, to your SBF point much earlier, David, I mean, the only difference between the investment banks and SBF are, one, the investment banks have federal, approval basically, and two, they're backed. So if for whatever reason it doesn't go well, it doesn't matter. We can print more. So it's also the ability to debase it, right? I do want to change topics a little bit, because I would be totally remiss if I did not. If I had Paul Allen on the podcast and didn't ask him a bunch of dumb questions about ancestry and genealogy, I have a couple if you're open to them.
Sure.
I am curious, is there some type of scoreboard? Like, is there one person that you're aware of who we have the farthest back genealogy for?
I mean, a lot of people...
Or any interesting tidbits like that?
A lot of people claim to be able to trace their ancestry, 2,000 years, and then clear back to Adam and Eve. But the trustworthiness of any of those family lines is close to zero. So no, okay. I don't know if there's like a world record holder for who's got the best documented genealogy going back, hundreds and hundreds or thousands of years. I think Asia, China has these village books. I know one man who takes the Gong family back to 862 AD, to an ancestor named Dragon Gong. Those are reliable. Those Asian cultures.
Ancestor name Dragon Gong.
Dragon Gong.
Holy
Wouldn't you
crap.
like to have an ancestor name?
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, but no, I think The government started really keeping birth, marriage, and death records in the 1600s. Churches did it for centuries before that. In many developing nations, there are millions of undocumented humans because they don't keep good records at all. So it's really mixed across the world. In the US, I think the fascination with genealogy is because we are a melting pot from hundreds of, dozens or scores of countries, and many Americans actually don't know where their ancestors were 100 or 200 years ago, and it's usually very diverse. When we went to Italy in 2008, trying to figure out how could we, do a lot of genealogy in Europe, it turns out that Italians are basically from the same place 300 years, 400 years in a row. And they thought genealogy was ridiculous because we already know this is our hometown and we've been here for hundreds of years. So the US is interesting, and it's by far the best market in the world for paid professional access to massive data sets. The DNA stuff is really interesting. And in 1999, a company in Iceland called Decode Genetics went public. And what Iceland had, which was really interesting, is they had public health records going back to the early 1900s. And then they had genealogy from Iceland going back hundreds of years. And the voters in Iceland voted on a referendum to make their public health records and genealogy records accessible for drug company research, to donate our records for the public good so that we can do more drug discovery. And Roche, I think, had a huge multi-$100 million deal with Decode Genetics. So in 99, that's when the idea of genetic genealogy, DNA testing, nuclear, mitochondrial DNA testing, that's when it hit my consciousness. So I tried to get Ancestry to buy a paternity testing company in San Jose called GeneTree. My friend Terry Carmichael started that. He used to work at Genentech. And I actually wrote the preface to a book that he published in 99. And we both imagined that one day DNA would be a really major contributor to our understanding of our family history. It turns out that Ancestry wasn't ready to buy that company in 99. One of our billionaire investors bought it a few years later, rebranded it, brought it to Salt Lake City, and then Ancestry bought it from him. So
nice.
Ancestry ended up with that company, but then it branched out beyond paternity testing to mitochondrial and all of the different SNPs and markers that can be useful in discovering your heritage.
Follow-up question. Have you ever considered using the moniker Father Time as the founder of Ancestry?
No,
that's a free one for you.
That's a really cool one. So there is a Utah Genealogy Association that's been around for like 100 years, and I think they only have 15 fellows. My title is FUGA, Fellow of the Utah Genealogy Association. And honestly, when they gave me a standing ovation in 2000 or 2001 and called me the father of online genealogy, it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. So, but Father Time's pretty awesome too.
So you're a humble man, Paul. If I were you, I'd be Paul Father Time Allen. That's awesome. Okay, I have another question. Were you guys like part of any interesting discoveries or anything you can think of in terms of like discovering new migration patterns of people through the genealogy?
People ask me deep genealogy questions all the time. I'm a data entrepreneur. I studied library science, card catalogs. My job is to go find data sets. I actually don't understand how to do genealogy myself. There are people that have authored books on, there's one book called The Great Migrations, and I think the author was Robert Anderson. I don't think he may still be alive, but these are, phenomenal professional genealogists working for American Ancestors or Family Search. And so there are tremendous breakthroughs in migration patterns that have come from the data sets and the genealogy, the DNA stuff that Ancestry's uncovered, but I haven't followed that. My favorite new area of genealogy research is called sediment DNA analysis. And I just follow things like, CRISPR gene editing. I like to just follow super smart people on X and find out. But if you do a deep dive into sediment DNA testing, you'll find that there is a potential in archaeology that anywhere where humans resided 500, 1,000, or 10,000 years ago and left a trace, it turns out that the human body sheds about 40,000 skin cells per day. Okay, so you got skin cells, you got trillions of cells in your body, 40,000 skin cells a day. They fall off your body if they connect with, I think it's it's a chemical, or there's a molecule, calcium. I think if it connects with calcium, it fossilizes instantly, and you don't need a skeleton or bone or teeth to extract DNA. So they can go through sediment and find the humans, the plants, and the animals who lived in that area. They go deeper and deeper into the sediment. I actually think in 10 or 20 years, it might be possible to almost recreate which humans lived on Earth that left no written records and maybe don't have any descendants in living DNA, but the sediment, archaeology, DNA testing could help us build a model of what humans lived where on this planet thousands of years ago.
Oh, man. Talk about the liberal horseshoe I was talking about. Wait for the no stolen land or stolen land arguments once that happens. Oh, buddy. I'm looking forward to that in the, 2038 election or whatever, whatever that happens.
Well, the thing that struck me in the Genesis account of creation, God says, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. And I believe in a human universal resurrection, because of Jesus Christ being resurrected. I think all mankind will be resurrected and judged for, good or evil to inherit whatever glory they inherit. But if you think about it, if there's a DNA trace of every human that's ever lived, maybe you resurrect them from that molecule, because the whole DNA strand is going to be there. Not that God needs any physical thing to, if he created us in the beginning, he could resurrect us in any way he chooses. But I think it's kind of fascinating that maybe every human who's ever lived has left a trace of their DNA bound to a molecule, and there is a residue of them somewhere on the planet.
Well, I mean, that's definitely consistent with the, energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred in terms of like our understanding of modern science, right? Like it's consistent, if nothing else, which would be very interesting. All right, that was all the ancestry questions I had. I had a couple jotted down that I just wanted to be sure I could touch on.
Yeah. Well, and I just wanted to say broadly, Paul, really appreciate, your leadership in freedom tech.
Oh, yeah.
Your support of Morpheus, your encouragement, to the people that have been building out this technology, highlighting, Morpheus at these conferences has been, extremely valuable because, like you said, people can only use something they're aware of, right? And so a lot of the job is just making them aware that there is an alternative. And Bo, to your point earlier, I think this is how we, solve that, disenchantment that people have with politics and these other things, because what's the solution? Okay, you can tell me all day about these terrible problems, but what do I do about it? Right. So it feels like, for those that were libertarian or independent minded in the 70s or 80s, well, there was no answer, right? Oh, well, just tell more people about this problem, as opposed to now you have smart contracts. Now you have decentralized intelligence. Now you have honest money. You have Bitcoin. You have real world solutions that you can hand somebody and it can radically change their life. And I think that's the mission. The mission is a lot easier than it used to be.
Yeah.
Because it's not just describing those problems in the abstract and then go try to change your government or something. You can take a choice as an individual. That's what partly really inspired me about Bitcoin in 2012 is I didn't have to convince 51% of my neighbors that Bitcoin was a good idea. I could take my dollars and opt into it as an individual, and that was it. And I haven't cared about the Federal Reserve policy since 2012 because I was able to opt out of the Federal Reserve policy because I thought it was fundamentally corrupt. As a funny story is I told my wife, I sold our dollars for Bitcoin. And she's like, you forgot to convert our retirement savings into Bitcoin. She's like, why would we hold dollars? They're inflationary and only lose value. And I married a free market economics nerd. And so I was like, God, I love you. I heard that that discussion went differently for other couples, but for filter for free market economics knowledge, it pays off over time. But now we have these real solutions, right? And it's not abstract. It's something very practical, and people can choose, to make that change. And I think that's what's happened in America, right? There was all this government resistance to crypto for a decade, right? Regulations, they pushed people out of the country, get out of here, go to Switzerland, go to somewhere else. And then finally, the weight of the people that chose to opt in, was enough to influence the system. And now, it's flipped to being friendly and people can flow back. And so change can happen over time, but it's nice that you can make an individual choice where you don't have to wait for the tragedy of the commons to resolve itself after a decade or two. So, Paul, I really appreciate your leadership in that framework, because that's the ultimate thing for me, is not waiting for political solutions, but empowering the individual.
Well, in 2012, when you embraced Bitcoin, and recently when you saw OpenClaw and how powerful that was, I am extremely optimistic that tens of millions of people this year in this country and 1 billion people around the world will soon experience the power of OpenClaw without the frustration of trying to understand it. The reason that Peter Steinberger said it took off is when he connected his agents, his OpenClaw agent, to WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram, and literally you will all be running your fleet of agents through a WhatsApp, or I'm going to use Telegram because I like Pavel Durov's, more secure platform. But imagine whatever instructions you type in Telegram to your fleet of agents, it does it for you. And when you record a meeting and your 10 agents are listening for new instructions and then they go do it, human productivity is going to skyrocket like never before. And the proceeds of that free market capitalism could inure to billions of people. Like, there's no limit, but it's a matter of awareness. It's not going to be technically challenging. It's going to be as easy as sending a text message to someone.
Yeah, this was my realization, Paul, that DeFi wasn't the end game. It's just a tool for AI.
Yeah,
was this thing where when I realized, oh, I don't need to teach someone how to use a ledger and how to sign a transaction and what a smart contract is. They'll just talk to their agent in natural language and the agent will do it. And my thought process went from, an institution's not going to be the end buyer or trying to be the end buyer of my Ethereum bag. It's going to be someone's agent or something's agent that wants to execute on chain and needs more Ethereum to do it. And that was the big switch of like, I use this quote all the time, and it's so funny. I never actually go back to look up whose quote it was, but it was whichever night show host said that crypto is great because it's all the stuff you don't understand about economics combined with all the stuff you don't understand about computers. And that is so incredibly true, but agents just abstract all of that. It just doesn't matter. It'll just be natural language. And so, yeah, that was really the realization that was like, okay, this is how that happens, But yeah, I totally echo David's points and sentiment too on just thanking you for the leadership in that, because it really is like, I cannot think of a more important thing to get right now in the world, just generally for humanity. I think that it is incredibly important that this gets done right.
Well, I believe that freedom and prosperity and peace are kind of universal desires, but the structures we've inherited for generations, the government and the corporations and the rules, the complexity, the inflationary fiat dollars, it's just cost so much. It's created so much suffering. But I think if we all aim towards, let's have individuals with maximal freedom, let's have peace and prosperity, let's not fund wars, and let's advocate for peace. And then, let's learn how to connect with each other. I feel like the rising generation is so involved in their screens that they often don't know how to make eye contact. They don't know what real friendship or real relationships are like. And I think as AI buys us more productivity gains, we'll have more time to also deepen our ability as humans to connect with other humans, to be kind, to be loving, to share abundance and ideas, so that goodness can spread to the end of the row. And I just think there's potentially a scenario. I don't think it's predetermined that we're going to have a collapse of civilization. because of AI or because of any geopolitical things, or it's not predetermined that we're all going to be abundant and prosperous forever. It depends on what we individually and collectively do. That's why it's so important to create alliances with people who are striving for the good for all. And I'm honored to know you, David. I've had several wonderful, deep conversations with you. We've been able to do some events together about Bowen. It's fantastic to meet you. Can't wait to digitize your father's decades career and give you access to that. But no, thank you both for letting me join you in this fantastic conversation today.
You're listening to Brainpower.